A childhood in luxurious shadows looking back. My earliest years seem wrapped in an odd blend of privilege and loneliness, a strange mixture of gold-plated surfaces and cold, echoing hallways. I'm Emily Bennett, and to anyone on the outside, I must have looked like the luckiest kid in Manhattan. Our townhouse in the Upper East Side was the kind of place that drew whispered envy at birthday parties. All marble floors, spiral staircases, and a chandelier whose crystals cast rainbows every morning. My father, William Bennett, owned a suite of hotels that bore our family crest, and my last name opened doors wherever I went. But if you think money can buy security or affection, you haven't spent a winter in my house. My mother passed away when I was 5, and I have no memories of her, except for faint impressions. A soft laugh, a silk scarf tangled in my small fingers. After that, the world shifted. My father buried his grief in work, and not long after, Katherine arrived, all smiles and perfect posture. She wasn't cruel, not on the surface, but she looked at me like I was someone else's misplaced baggage that she'd been forced to store. Then Olivia came, barely a year younger than me, the picture of what a real Bennett daughter should be. Blonde, charming, and effortlessly at home in the role of society princess. Most mornings, I woke up to the metallic click of heels echoing down our endless hallways, reminding me I was alone, save for the housekeeper's polite greetings and the occasional nod from my father when he wasn't away on business. Our family dinners were more performance than connection, each of us playing a part. Katherine dishing out compliments, Olivia chatting about her latest equestrian matches, my father distracted with his phone, and me, quietly picking at my food and pretending not to notice the glances they traded above my head. But I learned things in those silent years. I learned that being invisible lets you listen, and listening is power, especially when no one realizes the quiet one sees everything. When I wasn't filling my journals with secret poems and sketches, I'd eavesdrop outside my father's study, piecing together names of investors in board meetings. Even as a child, I understood that the real currents of our home ran in the undercurrents, in things unsaid and alliances sealed with a handshake behind closed doors. Still, I craved acceptance. I threw myself into every club and activity my school offered. You name it, I did it. Debate team, yearbook committee, orchestra. I thought if I racked up trophies and tried hard enough, maybe someone would notice. Maybe love was something I could earn. Sometimes Olivia would feign sisterly affection when there were guests. But the moment we were alone, the mask dropped. She'd remind me I was different, that I didn't quite belong. All those years, I learned to hide my disappointment behind a perfect smile. I pretended not to care, but there were nights I'd wander from room to room, wishing the house were full of laughter and real warmth. The wealth cocooned us from the world, but trapped me in my own small, private shadow. Still, every moment spent unnoticed became a spark, fueling a quiet resolve deep inside. I would not let myself fade into the wallpaper, not forever, always, reaching for perfection. From the very beginning, I wore the heavy armor of expectations. Maybe it started when I realized that simply being a Bennett wasn't enough to be truly wanted in my own home. I remember standing in the polished hallway of our townhouse, watching my stepmother adjust her pearls, her reflection sharp and perfect, as if she was made for the role that I was only rehearsing. I was Emily Bennett, the afterthought, the footnote. But I was determined that if I couldn't be loved for who I was, I would force the world to admire what I could become. School felt like a stage, and I was desperate for applause. I signed up for every club, debate team, yearbook committee, orchestra, anything that could paint my resume in gold. My mornings began 2 hours before sunrise. I'd practice violin until my fingertips throbbed, recite pages of debate materials until I could counter any argument by memory. My teachers liked me. They'd call me responsible, ambitious, focused. But what they didn't see was the underlying fear that ran like an electric current under every achievement. If I wasn't perfect, would anyone even see me? My family saw my report cards stacked with straight A's and trophies lined on my shelves. But no one ever asked how I felt after a test. My father, if he noticed at all, would offer a vague, "good job," with his attention elsewhere, or sometimes nothing. Katherine, my stepmother, would simply nod approvingly when guests were over, as if my successes were another accessory for the house. Olivia, my stepsister, just rolled her eyes, quick to remind me that society parties and poise mattered more than any medal I earned. There was a strange, hollow satisfaction in being the best. Success was supposed to make things better, but really, it felt like I was treading water. I was careful about every move, desperate not to slip up. I developed an instinct for reading the room, knowing just when to laugh at Katherine's carefully rehearsed jokes, or how to disappear when my father's mood was dark. I trained myself to never cry in public. Alone in my room at night, though, sometimes I'd sketch pictures in my journal that no one would ever see. Images of a girl with a paper crown, smiling on cue for the crowd, tears staining her cheeks after the curtain fell. I kept hoping, maybe foolishly, that if I achieved enough, eventually I'd cross some invisible finish line and finally feel like someone worthy of belonging. I set impossible goals, pushed through endless rehearsals, aced every test, scanned crowds for a familiar nod that never really came. My perfectionism slowly became its own prison, one I built brick by invisible brick, hoping it would protect me, but realizing all along it only kept me isolated. Still, for every disappointment, I told myself to try harder, dig deeper, smile wider. I wasn't about to fade quietly into the background, not when I had so much left to prove. Looking back now, I think that relentless drive was the very thing that saved me. When it mattered most, when family was no longer a word tied to safety, but to loss. I had already learned how to survive without applause, and that, ironically, became my greatest strength. The blow that changed everything. If there's a moment that cleaves a life into before and after, for me, it came the spring I turned 25. I will never forget that morning. The sky brittle and cloudless, the city inexplicably loud outside my window when I got the call. My father was dead. A sudden, brutal illness took him in less than a month. In that instant, the ground beneath my world gave way, leaving only questions echoing through the emptiness he left behind. Losing him didn't just break my heart. It tore open a fault line inside the entire Bennett family. For all his distance, my father had been a kind of gravitational force holding our strange constellation together. Katherine, equal parts gracious and icy. Olivia, who'd become a socialite in her own right. And me, the quiet, perfectionist daughter desperate to be noticed. His absence magnified every crack we'd papered over for so many years. Grief in our house was not a shared experience. Katherine's mourning was fastidious. Black dresses, immaculate veils, and a carefully curated sorrow for public consumption. Olivia turned her pain into parties, social events, travel plans. It was as if keeping busy would keep the truth away. I grieved in silence, wandering our home's empty, echoing rooms. With him gone, our house felt like a mausoleum dressed in luxury, cold, impersonal, the very definition of loneliness. But the real wound came later. For weeks, I lived in a fog. There were endless condolences, flowers that filled the foyer, and a steady stream of lawyers in crisp suits. I tried to throw myself into the logistics, organizing the funeral, answering letters, tending to details my stepmother ignored. I assumed, naively perhaps, that this would be the moment my efforts bore fruit, the moment I would finally be acknowledged as the daughter my father had always counted on in private. Looking back, I realize how childlike that hope was. When the will was finally read, the truth set in. Nothing was what it seemed. All those late-night dinners where Dad promised I'd play a role in the family company, all the years I'd studied and sacrificed, believing I was being groomed to inherit his legacy. In a twist filled with bitter irony, the will had been edited just weeks before his death. Control of Bennett Enterprises, every significant share, every seat on the board was transferred to Katherine and Olivia. My name was there, but barely. A trust fund for my living expenses, a passing mention, and little else. There was no position, no power, nothing but a polite footnote. The betrayal burned deeper than any humiliation Olivia had ever dealt me, and the chill in Katherine's tone as she explained that this was for the best, darling. You're not really suited for this world, is something I still hear at night. Most people would dissolve at that kind of rejection. I wanted to rage. Believe me, I did. I thought about storms, about smashing plates, about vanishing for good. Each time I tried to plead my case, they brushed me aside. Katherine was all legalese and gracious condescension. Olivia, ever the actress, would feign sympathy in public, then gloat in private about finally being first in the family. What haunted me most were the little things, monogrammed towels that disappeared from my bathroom, the way the staff avoided my gaze, the reprogramming of security so I no longer had unrestricted access to my childhood home. That summer, I hit rock bottom. My so-called friends from the social scene faded away when the party invites stopped coming. I spent months at coffee shops instead of company boardrooms, filling notebook after notebook with plans and angry scribbles. What had all my striving amounted to? If this was the reward, I felt invisible, unwanted, and utterly powerless. Yet, within that emptiness, something else slowly began to grow, a spark of stubborn resolve. If no one else was going to fight for me, I would have to become my own advocate. Instead of fading away, I started searching for cracks in their perfect narrative. I read every article of incorporation, every legal document relating to Bennett Enterprises. I mapped out the board, traced past deals, watched for inconsistencies in Katherine's management style. In time, I realized that even the most seamless facades develop hairline fractures when subjected to the right pressure. I may have been written out of the story, but I hadn't lost my skills. All those years of observation, of listening from the shadows, were finally about to pay off. No one knew it then, but the silent daughter, always polite, always perfect, was about to become their most dangerous adversary. Because nothing fuels a comeback like betrayal, and nothing sharpens ambition like the knowledge that the only person you can rely on is yourself. Light in the darkness, the heart of steel plan. After the will was read and the rug was yanked from under my feet, I spiraled for a time into rage and self-pity, alternating between pacing my tiny sublet in Soho late at night and wandering the city just to escape the sense of abandonment. But somewhere, amid the haze of loss, the fog began to clear. The bitterness curdled into something less destructive. Resolve. I realized I had a choice: remain the victim of their orchestration or become my own advocate, maybe even my family's reckoning. I started where I always start in a crisis: learning, observing, documenting. I mapped out the Bennett Enterprises corporate structure, traced every family asset, tracked which board members swung their loyalties depending on who had the upper hand. I called up past advisors of my father's, some of whom had left the company quietly in the lead-up to his death. Most were initially wary. After all, to most of the world, I was a minor footnote in the Bennett narrative, the artsy daughter content to stay out of the power games. But I had an advantage no one else did: my invisibility. Katherine and Olivia had underestimated just how much someone on the margins could see. I knew their habits, their favorite haunts, the irregularities in expense accounts, even the language of Katherine's half-hearted apologies when she slipped up in public. At night, I constructed elaborate mind maps of their associates, printing newspaper clippings and connecting the dots. My little studio apartment became a war room. Walls covered with legal pads, color-coded files, sticky notes, and the unshakable belief that I knew something they didn't. Knowing I couldn't use the Bennett name openly in the legal world, I reached out to an old friend from college who'd broken into Wall Street with her own tenacity. Cassie, blunt and brilliant, was happy to help in exchange for absolute discretion. Together, we scoured whistleblower reports, company filings, and quietly spread word that I was looking for new opportunities outside the family business. It was a convenient lie. My real work happened in whispers and backroom handshakes. I found allies among the old guard, loyal advisors my father had trusted, now estranged by Katherine's consolidation of power. With Cassie's help, I even unearthed an email thread that exposed Olivia's creative expense reporting and Katherine's use of shell properties to filter company money into her own accounts. Still, none of that mattered without a coalition. I began scheduling coffee and dinners with potential company allies, other board members, strategic partners, legacy investors. We never spoke openly. No one wanted their cards on the table too soon. But there was a shared weariness about Katherine's direction. One by one, with cautious optimism, these allies started agreeing to let me keep them informed. The careless arrogance of Katherine and Olivia had left just enough cracks in the company's armor for me to slip through. The hardest and loneliest nights were when doubt gnawed at my confidence. What if I failed? What if all I'd done amounted to nothing? I knew that if I stumbled publicly, Katherine would twist the narrative. Poor Emily, never able to let go of her fairy tale dreams. But each time I revisited my motivation, my desire not for vengeance, but for respect, for an end to my invisibility, I reminded myself that setbacks were proof I was moving forward. In the darkness of anonymity, I carved out a steel heart and pointed my resolve like a weapon. The final phase required patience and careful planning. I kept expanding my files on financial irregularities, documenting every shady deal, every skipped protocol. Cassie and I drew up a plan for what would become the loudest whisper campaign in company history, releasing strategic information to the right people at the right time. I coordinated with journalists who had previously written politely about the Bennett family, hinting at an exclusive that would become front-page news if Katherine's and Olivia's failings ever surfaced. Meanwhile, I stayed outwardly polite at company functions and never missed a charity ball. Katherine considered me effectively housebroken, and Olivia ignored me entirely. But beneath the silk and pearls, I was galvanizing a resistance, one brittle smile at a time. Eventually, I had enough leverage for a showdown, a stack of signed statements, legal memos, and allies with voting power. All those years spent being invisible, listening, trying to be perfect. This was the trial they had unwittingly prepared me for. They had given me the tools for my own comeback. I just had to be strong enough to use them. Secret alliances in the high-stakes games. Forming alliances when you're the outcast of a dynasty is an art of camouflage. In the high-gloss chambers of Manhattan business, everyone's playing a game, and trust is as rare as snow in July. I knew if I wanted to reclaim what was rightfully mine, I couldn't do it alone. I needed eyes and ears inside the company and sympathetic hands outside. People who could see beyond my reputation as the artistic Bennett, the daughter everyone assumed would fade quietly into the shadows. This was the first time in my life I truly understood that power wasn't about titles or bloodlines. It was about proximity, information, and vulnerability, wielded with precision. It began slow, almost invisible. I reached out to my father's old friends, those shunted aside by Katherine when she tightened her grip on Bennett Enterprises. Over quiet coffees in Brooklyn cafes, I listened to their stories, slowly earning their respect. Some were bitter, others just tired, and far too many still resented the arrogance that swept through the company after my father passed. A few were genuinely surprised to see the quiet daughter daring to enter the fray. And that shock became my leverage. In private, with no boardroom bravado or curated family image, I was just Emily. That, for too long, had seemed like a disadvantage. Now, it was the skeleton key. One evening stands out, a blink and miss it meeting in a smoky bar in Midtown with Jonathan Crane, Dad's former chief financial officer. He'd left months before the will was read. His sudden departure, a black mark on the family's tidy narrative. "Emily," he said, swirling a cocktail glass, "sometimes the best move isn't to fight for a chair at the table. It's to build your own, with new players." Those words echoed for weeks as I set about assembling my network. Former department heads, minor shareholders slighted by Olivia's condescension. Even a no-nonsense receptionist who, after a decade at the company's front desk, knew more about its secrets than any lawyer. These meetings, these whispered alliances in the city's anonymous corners, became my lifeline. My strategy was simple: offer respect, promise discretion, and prove, over and over, that I wasn't returning to the old ways. I asked questions no Bennett ever had. What made you loyal to my father? Which decisions drove you away? Every conversation was documented in a thick, handwritten journal locked in my apartment's safe. Of course, this was Manhattan. No one played straight. Espionage cuts both ways. And I knew every interaction circled back to Katherine and Olivia in rumors, half-truths, and gossip. So, I planted decoys. At charity galas, I'd mention I was working on a nonprofit project, or leaving the country for a while. I let slip rumors I'd lost interest in the company entirely. The more they underestimated me, the more careless they became in public. Katherine's confidants, hungry for power, sometimes offered up morsels of gossip themselves, testing if I could be bought. They stayed vague, but every snippet helped sketch a map of shifting loyalties and vulnerabilities. Behind the social masks, I watched for cracks. I noticed which board members skipped meetings when Olivia sat as acting chairwoman. I noted which suppliers, quietly pressured for kickbacks, now looked to me for a possible change in leadership. My father's generation valued quiet loyalty. Katherine's reign was all flash and intimidation. There were more dissatisfied voices within the company than I'd ever realized. People hungry for stability, for honor, for something more than backroom deals and performative compassion. By midwinter, my network resembled an underground railroad for truth. One young analyst from compliance, Lily, slipped me a USB drive filled with discrepancies in quarterly reports, something she'd flagged internally and promptly had dismissed. I offered her the only thing I could, the promise that, if I succeeded, her courage wouldn't be forgotten. More came forward, often anonymously: tips, login accounts, rumors about shell corporations owned by my stepmother overseas. Sometimes the information was useless, but more often, it was a missing puzzle piece. I spent nights cross-referencing databases, tracking wire transfers, and mapping relationships on my apartment walls, the city lights spilling through my window as my only witness. I worked long hours under a jaundiced desk lamp, legal pads stacked like bricks beside empty coffee mugs. My college friend Cassie, now my closest confidant and an investment analyst, Wall Street, brought not only expertise, but also a fierce loyalty to the cause. She taught me the art of reading people's body language in negotiations and how to use silence as leverage. She teased that I was starting to look like a Wall Street sleuth. Our operation had layers. Cassie handled tip-offs on market rumors. I dealt with the human side. Slowly, with every new ally, every courageous whistleblower, I became the nucleus of a growing vortex of truth seekers and disillusioned insiders. There was no master plan, just a gradual coalescence of shared dissatisfaction. Each person had their reasons, but we all wanted to see the company restored to something honorable and lasting. Yet every step forward carried risk. I was warned, directly and obliquely, not to meddle. Old friends tried to talk me down, fearful for my reputation, and, quietly, for my safety. Katherine's legal advisors sent friendly reminders about the terms of the trust fund, hinting that I could lose what little security I had if I pushed too far. Olivia pretended not to care, but her social media became a bullhorn for the company's new era, awash in images of her at high-profile galas and misleading press statements about future expansions. I had to be careful, so I encrypted my files, changed my phone numbers, and even hired a friend from grad school, a cybersecurity expert, to sweep my apartment for bugs. Paranoia became part of the daily routine and, oddly, a source of comfort. After all those years being cut out and ignored, the feeling that someone finally saw me, even as a threat, meant I was making progress. The high-stakes games intensified as the company's annual shareholders meeting approached. I met with major investors at odd hours, pitching them on a vision of stability, integrity, and smart leadership. Some were receptive, others played coy. I knew I couldn't convince everyone, but all it would take was a core group with enough voting power to call for an audit, or at least publicly question Katherine's stewardship. Every conversation became a negotiation, every minor victory a reason for guarded hope. It was a chess match with invisible pieces. Some days, I second-guessed myself, worried I was risking everything for a lost cause. But then, a new piece of evidence would arrive, or another staff member would reach out, hesitant yet hopeful that things could change. I built my confidence on small wins, a hard-earned email, a hidden ledger, a whispered promise in a coffee shop. The more people I brought into the fold, the clearer it became. I may have been the family misfit, but I was becoming a leader in my own right, by showing others the respect I had always craved. Late one night, Cassie looked up from her laptop, her face illuminated by an ocean of spreadsheets. "You realize you're the only one they couldn't see coming?" she said, half smiling. "That's your superpower, Em. Never forget it." I wrote those words in my journal, circled twice in bright red ink. The secret alliances, the covert games, the blend of hope and desperation. It wasn't just business anymore. It was family, legacy, redemption. I ended every day tired but electrified, knowing I was finally carving out a space in the world on my terms. One whispered alliance and strategic move at a time. The relentless showdown. The day of the annual family shareholders meeting arrived, and with it, a storm churned in my chest. Equal parts dread, determination, and something that felt almost like hope. For months, I'd lived with this moment looming over me, nurturing a defiant flame that, despite all odds, had somehow grown into a blazing resolve. This wasn't just about regaining a name on a brass plaque, or even the money. It was about taking back my story, refusing to fade, and finally confronting the women who had tried to erase me from existence. I barely slept the night before. I watched the city lights flicker from my apartment's window and recited every detail of my plan, afraid that if I let doubt in, the cracks might show. My war room was a mess of papers, color-coded files, sticky notes, USB drives, and a journal filled with promises to myself. Cassie dropped by at sunrise with 2 giant coffees and that crooked grin of hers. "You ready to start a revolution?" she teased. I could only nod, clutching the thumb drive that felt heavier than a grenade. By the time I strode through the revolving glass doors of Bennett Enterprises, my heart hammered so loudly I was sure everyone could hear. The marble lobby gleamed, a cold, perfect setting that forever reminded me of my childhood isolation. This time, though, I was no silent observer. Every purposeful step echoed my defiance. Board members nodded out of habit, but many looked wary, as if sensing something had shifted. Katherine and Olivia were already present, both immaculate in designer black, exuding an air of unshakable confidence. Katherine smiled with the poise of a practiced politician. Olivia barely acknowledged me, already busy charming the family's most powerful, old-guard investors. The meeting room itself was a theater, dark walnut paneling, a chrome conference table, the city skyline as a high-stakes backdrop. For a moment, I remembered kneeling under this very table as a child, drawing in secret while the adults made decisions about my life. Today, I sat at the head, not because a placard named me as such, but because I had finally claimed my place in the narrative. The room filled with board members, shareholders, high-level executives, legal sharks, and a handful of cautiously supportive allies. My allies slid in quietly, nodding their credibility my way. Cassie gave me a quick squeeze on the shoulder as the meeting was called to order. Katherine opened with her signature grace, a glacial, practiced summary of the year's successes, peppered with hollow reassurances that the company was stronger than ever. She praised Olivia for stepping up, thanked the board, threw a few veiled jabs about respecting tradition. I listened with a blank, polite smile, my mind racing through the evidence I'd collected. All the while, Olivia flashed her pageant-perfect grin and fielded softball questions, winking at allies and pretending her hands were clean. Then, as the scripted performance neared its end, I made my move. I stood, my hands steady, but my voice quivering at first, only to steady, as years of fear drained away into a cold, clear conviction. Before we proceed, I'd like to raise an urgent matter of governance, I announced, catching the eyes of every person in the room. Silence fell. Katherine's smile didn't falter, but I saw her fingers clutch the chair's armrest. I laid out my findings in meticulous order. Step by step, I traced financial irregularities, shell companies, unapproved transfers, bloated expense accounts, whistleblower reports. I referenced internal audits and compliance tip-offs that I had corroborated with third parties. Every document was backed up, every statement cross-verified. At first, a few board members shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to displease Katherine. But as I produced emails, signed statements, and direct evidence of mismanagement, skepticism turned into shock. Even the most stoic old money partners leaned in, their skepticism melting into the beginnings of outrage. Olivia sprang to life, her voice pitched a little too high. This is a misunderstanding. My stepsister has always resented our family's role. I shut her down. This isn't personal, Olivia. This is about integrity. This company was built by my father's vision, not to be siphoned off for personal gain. I glanced at the compliance analyst, Lily, whose hands trembled in her lap, but who nodded at me with grateful resolve. Cassie loaded up a projection, side-by-side charts, disproving Katherine's claims and throwing their once glossy facade into sharp relief. Katherine tried to wrest back control, voice brittle with composure. Emily is mistaken. She has no standing. Yet the words rang hollow, and every face in the room could sense the tide shifting. One by one, my allies chimed in, confirming my findings, and the chain of support grew undeniable. The room boiled over with questions, grilled by longtime board members and new shareholders who demanded clarity. I looked directly at the men and women who had once dismissed me as an afterthought. I am not asking for pity, I said. I am demanding accountability. My father entrusted us all with a legacy built on trust and hard work. If we allow this to continue, we lose not just our company, but our name. Olivia grew frantic, alternating between denials and tears, attempting to sway sympathy. Katherine, sensing her empire slipping, launched into an attack, challenging my right to speak, attempting legalese threats, even dangling the trust fund as a carrot. But I held the floor, refusing to flinch. Every move had been anticipated. Cassie texted supportive messages discreetly from her phone, and a few crucial investors vouched outright for my findings. The board chair, after a long pause, called for an independent forensic audit, fully public, reporting directly to all shareholders. That was the turning point. Even Katherine couldn't mask her fury. Olivia spun excuses, some bordering on outright fabrications. But the collective mood had changed. The younger executives saw a new path forward. The older guard, loyal to my father's principles, voiced support for transparency. I watched as slowly the hands that had locked me out reached, tentatively but surely, for common ground. Within days, the news hit the business circuit. Bennett Enterprises would undergo a full-scale investigation. Katherine and Olivia were suspended pending results. A special committee appointed me as interim head, supported by my growing coalition and guided by Cassie's expertise. My first days in charge were a blur of meetings, crisis management calls, and endless confrontations with the mess Katherine and Olivia had left behind. The press was ruthless. Every move I made was dissected. But for the first time, I felt a strange sense of liberation. I was no longer living in the margins, no longer hiding behind perfect manners or an invisible smile. I had shown myself, scars and all, and the world actually listened. It wasn't easy. There were threats. Anonymous letters slid beneath my door, cold glares in the elevator, old family friends warning me to back down. Some allies wavered, their confidence shaken by the very power plays that had exiled me before. I kept a tight circle, trusted only those who had earned their place. Sometimes at night, I'd reread my old journals, remembering the lonely girl who scribbled dreams in secret. Now, I was building my legacy in the open, for all to see. Cassie and I worked into the early hours, balancing damage control in the delicate art of forging new partnerships. We invited employees, once fearful for their jobs, to speak honestly. We listened to whistleblowers with respect, and I enacted open-door policies that would have horrified Katherine. I learned the power of apology when needed, and stood my ground when it was warranted. As the audit unfolded, the depths of corruption and neglect came to light. I worked closely with investigators, providing every file and testimony they required. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, proving not only misappropriated funds, but a web of intimidation and mismanagement stretching back years. Each new discovery was a double-edged sword. Vindication for me, but a fresh wound in my family's already scarred legacy. A few board members who'd once sided with Katherine approached me, apologizing, tentatively offering guidance or assistance. I accepted their words, carefully, quietly, but without bitterness. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about restoring what could be restored, and finally giving a voice to those who'd been ignored. By the third month, the board convened to vote on lasting changes, new oversight, fresh ethics standards, and, unexpectedly, my appointment as permanent CEO. I stared at the unsigned contract for an hour, the significance washing over me. I wasn't the afterthought anymore, nor the orphan drifting through marble halls. I was the architect of my own fate. I signed my name with trembling fingers, feeling every lesson, every slight, and every triumph press into the paper. Still, the personal reckoning remained. Katherine fought the findings with every legal tool at her disposal. Olivia waged a campaign of slander and whispered rumors in society circles. But their power was gone. The empire built on illusions crumbled under the weight of truth. I visited my father's grave the day the decision became official. I stood in silence, sunlight trembling through autumn leaves. For so long, I'd wanted his validation, his affection, a sign that I'd finally made him proud. But as I laid a small note at the headstone, a promise to restore the company's honor, I realized I was truly doing this for myself, for the girl who had endured in silence, and for the woman who had fought her way, brick by invisible brick, from shadow to light. Looking back, I sometimes feel a strange gratitude for the betrayal. Without it, I might have drifted on the currents of privilege, always the obedient daughter, always the outsider. Instead, adversity forged resilience. My voice, once dismissed, became the catalyst for transformation. In the relentless showdown with my family's legacy, I discovered both the cost and the worth of being truly seen, and finally, respected as my own person, a place I've earned, my true beginning. For a long time, I used to believe that happy endings were reserved for people in storybooks, those flawless, smiling heroes who never had to fight too hard or pay too great a price for their victory. But as I stare out the corner office window, sun streaming over a city that once seemed hostile and indifferent, I know my own story doesn't fit neatly into those fairy tale patterns. Mine came at a cost. Mine was messy, painful, exhilarating, measured in small scars and quiet triumphs. But above all, it's undeniably mine. Being named permanent CEO of Bennett Enterprises was not the finish line I once thought it might be. It was more like emerging from a storm-battered forest, squinting into daylight for the first time. In those early days, I felt equal parts proud and terrified. The desk, once my father's, seemed almost too big. His photo, young, smiling, confident, rested beside the lamp. Sometimes I'd brush dust from the silver frame and wonder what he'd think. Was I living up to his legacy? Would he have chosen differently if he'd truly seen me? The company was still reeling from scandal when I stepped in. I inherited not just its assets, but its wounds, employees fearful of layoffs, bruised investor confidence, department heads wary of my leadership, and memories of Katherine's iron-fisted rule. There were awkward first meetings, where some avoided eye contact, unsure if I'd carry on my stepmother's vendettas or become just another cold figurehead. I made a conscious effort to counter that. Instead of sweeping changes overnight, I started by listening. I met with managers, analysts, receptionists, the people who made the company tick, but had so often been overlooked. I wanted their stories, their anxieties, their hopes for a better future. Some were hesitant, voices low and uncertain, but as I shared bits of my own journey, confessing my fears, acknowledging my outsider status, I felt the walls easing. I implemented monthly open forums, something that would have horrified the previous regime, and made transparency the bedrock of every initiative. I revised the old code of conduct, baked ethical oversight into daily operations, and set up an anonymous whistleblower system monitored by a third party. Shocks from the audit needed to mean real change. Each time someone voiced a concern and saw it addressed, trust grew, molecule by molecule. There were failures too, ideas that flopped, pilot projects that revealed more issues than solutions, and at least one high-level executive who tried to manipulate my inexperience against me. But old lessons resurfaced. Never show your hand too quickly. Respect people's dignity even when they challenge you. And always, always keep the long game in view. At night, exhaustion weighed heavy, but so did a fierce satisfaction. I was guiding a ship through rough waters. Yes, but for the first time, it was my grip on the wheel. My personal life began to quietly transform as well. The parade of fair-weather friends from my old social world had predictably vanished, but in their absence, deeper relationships formed. Cassie, now officially my chief strategy officer, became both confidant and co-conspirator. Lily from compliance blossomed into a vital voice of reform, living proof of the company's new openness. We celebrated milestones together in the break room, sometimes in laughter, sometimes with silent tears that meant more than any speech. Reclaiming my place in the family was more bittersweet. Legally, Katherine challenged the board's decisions at every turn, her lawyers spamming me with threats and injunctions. Olivia, shunned by most of Manhattan's social elite, posted melodramatic stories on the internet about her own betrayal, painting herself as martyr rather than architect of her downfall. I chose not to answer. Some wounds weren't worth reopening, and my energy was needed elsewhere. I reconnected, slowly, with a few estranged relatives. My mother's sister, a great uncle in Boston. They told stories about family I'd never known. There was comfort there, a sense of roots. For the first time, my sense of belonging didn't depend on Katherine's approval or my place in tabloid society. I was forging a different lineage, one built on integrity, mutual respect, and a refusal to let the past dictate the future. But the most profound change, I think, was internal. For so long, I'd viewed myself through other people's lenses. The overlooked child, the perfectionist, the outsider. I chased acceptance, shaped my life to fit a mold someone else built. But standing in the executive boardroom, explaining our new values to a packed house, I realized I'd finally become the person I needed as a lonely girl, scribbling in her journal years ago. I spoke with calm conviction, not because I wanted anyone's praise, but because purpose had replaced the old hunger for validation. Success, as it turns out, is less about applause and more about knowing you're walking in alignment with your values. Sometimes, in those rare, quiet moments at home, or in my early morning stroll through Central Park, I feel the old anxiety whisper.
Come on, Mom.
Am I enough?
Really,
Is
I'm
it safe to
fine.
breathe?
Everything is
I answer
totally
back
fine.
now with confidence. Yes, I built this. I survived, adapted, outgrew their shadows, and chose my own light. The legacy of Bennett Enterprises is no longer just a name on the skyline, but a living testament to transformation. We host community workshops, invest in employee wellness, and partner with nonprofits tackling childhood poverty. My personal tribute to the girl who once felt powerless behind marble walls. I know the company will always attract critics. The world of power and privilege is unforgiving, and rumors never truly die. But instead of shrinking from the spotlight, I lean in. Sometimes I even smile, remembering the invisible daughter who once tiptoed down echoing hallways, hungry for approval. If she could see me now, a leader with scars and wisdom, a woman who owns her story, what would she say? I think she'd be proud. This is not the end of my journey, but the opening of a long-awaited chapter. My days are no longer measured by the space I take up in someone else's house, but by the changes I set in motion, the loyalties I nurture, and the future I help others imagine. I am not haunted by my family's legacy. I am building upon it, forging something honest and lasting from the ruins of old betrayals. And as I turn off my office light at midnight, the city glowing far below, I whisper a quiet promise to both my father and to myself. No more shrinking, no more silence. The world will hear my voice and see my work. This is my place at last, the one I claimed by surviving and enduring, but ultimately by daring to choose a new beginning for us all.